The morning sun cast long shadows across the concrete formation area at Fort Brennan as 200 fresh recruits stood in perfect lines, their boots polished to mirror shine and their uniforms crisp with military precision. But in the third row, seventh position from the left, one figure disrupted the seamless display of military bearing. Marcus Chen shifted his weight slightly, favoring his right leg as he tried to maintain the rigid posture required during morning formation. The subtle movement was barely noticeable to most observers, but to the sharp eyes of his fellow recruits, it might as well have been a neon sign advertising weakness in a place where strength was everything. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. What none of them knew was that beneath his standard issue green undershirt, hidden against his chest, lay a small metal pin that told a story of courage under fire that would redefine everything they thought they understood about strength and the true meaning of military service. Marcus Chen had arrived at Fort Brennan 3 weeks earlier, with the same dreams and determination as every other recruit who passed through the gates of the sprawling military installation in North Carolina. At 24, he was older than most of the 18 and 19-year-olds who made up the majority of his training company. But his age wasn't what set him apart from his peers. It was the barely perceptible limp in his left leg that he tried desperately to minimize during every march, every drill, and every moment when the eyes of his drill instructors might be watching. The injury wasn't visible to the casual observer. Marcus had learned to compensate well over the past 18 months, adjusting his gait and posture in ways that masked the weakness in his left ankle and the chronic pain that shot up his leg during prolonged periods of standing or marching. His medical clearance for military service had been hard-won, requiring multiple evaluations and a determination by military doctors that his injury wouldn't prevent him from fulfilling his duties as a soldier, but medical clearance was one thing. Acceptance by his fellow recruits was proving to be something else entirely. Marcus had grown up in Sacramento, California, the son of second-generation Chinese-American parents who had built a successful small business importing electronics. His father, David Chen, had served briefly in the Army Reserve during the 1990s and had instilled in Marcus deep respect for military service and the sacrifices made by those who chose to defend their country. His mother, Linda, had initially opposed Marcus's decision to enlist, preferring that he continue his studies in engineering at UC Davis. But she had eventually come to understand that her son felt called to serve something greater than himself. The path that had led Marcus to Fort Brennan hadn't been straightforward. After graduating high school with honors, he had indeed started college, pursuing a degree in mechanical engineering while working part-time at his parents' business. His life had been comfortable, predictable, and filled with the kind of middle-class stability that many young Americans took for granted. But during his junior year, everything had changed in a way that would reshape his understanding of duty, sacrifice, and what it meant to truly serve others. The turning point had come during a spring break trip to Colorado with his girlfriend, Sarah Martinez, and a group of college friends. They had been hiking in Rocky Mountain National Park when a sudden afternoon thunderstorm had caught their group exposed on a ridge above treeline. As they hurried to reach the safety of lower elevation, Sarah had slipped on wet rocks and fallen approximately 30 feet down a steep embankment, landing hard on a rocky outcrop with her leg bent at an unnatural angle, while his friends had panicked, calling for help on their cell phones and debating whether it was safe to attempt a rescue. Marcus had immediately begun the dangerous descent to reach Sarah. The rocks were slick with rain. The visibility was poor due to heavy clouds, and one wrong step could have sent him tumbling even further down the mountainside. But Marcus had never hesitated, using techniques he'd learned from years of rock climbing as a hobby. He'd carefully made his way down to where Sarah lay semi-conscious and clearly in severe pain. For the next 4 hours, till park rangers and emergency medical personnel could reach their location, Marcus had stayed with Sarah on that narrow ledge. He had used his own jacket to keep her warm, fashioned a makeshift splint from hiking poles and strips of clothing, and maintained constant communication with the rescue team via radio relay through his friends above. When hypothermia had begun to set in due to the cold rain and Sarah's body's shock response, Marcus had used his own body heat to keep her core temperature stable, never leaving her side despite the continued danger from falling rocks and the possibility of another landslide. The rescue had been successful. Sarah had recovered fully after surgery to repair her fractured femur and had returned to complete her degree in education. But during those 4 hours on the mountain, something fundamental had changed in Marcus's understanding of himself and what he was capable of when others were counting on him. The calm focus he had maintained under extreme pressure, the willingness to risk his own safety for someone else's welfare, the satisfaction he had felt from making decisions that directly impacted another person's survival had awakened something in him that couldn't be satisfied by textbooks and engineering problems. After the mountain rescue, Marcus had begun volunteering with the local search and rescue team, training in wilderness medicine and technical rescue techniques. He had discovered that he had a natural aptitude for the work and, more importantly, that helping others in crisis situations gave his life a sense of purpose that nothing else had ever provided. His grades in engineering school remained strong, but his heart was increasingly drawn to the idea of a career where he could serve others in meaningful ways. The decision to enlist in the Army had crystallized during his senior year when a military recruiter had visited his campus to speak about opportunities in military engineering and logistics. The recruiter, Staff Sergeant Williams, had described the Army's role in humanitarian missions, disaster relief operations, and infrastructure development in war-torn regions. Marcus had realized that military service could combine his engineering background with his newfound passion for helping others in challenging circumstances. His parents had been initially resistant to the idea. They had sacrificed considerably to provide Marcus with educational opportunities and couldn't understand why he would abandon a promising engineering career to join the military. But Marcus had persisted, explaining that he felt called to serve something larger than his own personal success, and that the skills he would learn in the Army would ultimately make him a better engineer and a more complete person. The injury that now caused his slight limp had occurred during the summer between his college graduation and his scheduled departure for basic training. Marcus had been volunteering with the search and rescue team on a mission to locate a missing hiker in the Sierra Nevada mountains. The operation had been complicated by unstable weather and difficult terrain, but the missing person had been found alive after 2 days of searching. During the final evacuation, as the team was carrying the injured hiker down a steep trail in failing light, Marcus had volunteered to serve as the rear guard, ensuring that no equipment was left behind, and that the evacuation route remained clear for other team members. While negotiating a particularly treacherous section of loose rock, his footing had given way and he had fallen approximately 15 feet, landing hard on his left side. The immediate damage had been a severely sprained ankle, multiple contusions, and a hairline fracture in his left fibula. More concerning had been the ligament damage in his ankle, which had required surgery and extensive physical therapy. The doctors had been optimistic about his recovery, but they had warned that he might always have some residual weakness and occasional pain in the affected leg. For most people, the injury would have been an inconvenience that healed over time, and left them with perhaps a slight tendency to favor one leg over the other during strenuous activity. But for someone preparing to enter military service, where physical fitness standards were demanding and any sign of weakness could be seen as a liability, the injury had posed a significant challenge to Marcus's plans. He had spent the next 6 months in intensive physical therapy, working with trainers who specialized in helping athletes return to peak performance after injuries. He had modified his exercise routine, learned new techniques for managing pain and maintaining strength, and gradually rebuilt his fitness to the point where he could pass the Army's physical fitness tests. The process had been difficult, requiring a level of dedication and pain tolerance that tested his commitment to military service. But Marcus had never considered abandoning his goal. When he had finally received medical clearance for military service, it had come with the understanding that his injury was considered compatible with military duty, but would require ongoing monitoring and potential accommodations during certain training activities. Marcus had accepted these conditions, grateful for the opportunity to serve despite his physical limitations. Now, 3 weeks into basic training at Fort Brennan, Marcus was discovering that medical clearance and peer acceptance were two very different things. The rigorous daily schedule of physical training, drill exercises, and classroom instruction was challenging for every recruit. But Marcus's injury added an extra layer of difficulty that he struggled to hide from his fellow soldiers and, more importantly, from his drill instructors. Each morning began at 0500 hours with physical training that included running, calisthenics, and strength exercises designed to build the kind of fitness required for military service. Marcus could complete all the required activities, but he had to work harder than his peers to achieve the same results, and the chronic pain in his ankle made every step a conscious effort to maintain proper form and avoid showing weakness. The afternoon drill sessions were perhaps even more challenging. Standing at attention for extended periods put considerable stress on his injured ankle, and the precise marching movements required for military ceremonies demanded a level of coordination that was difficult to maintain when one leg couldn't quite match the strength and flexibility of the other. Marcus had learned to shift his weight subtly, to time his movements carefully, and to use his upper body positioning to compensate for the limitations in his left leg. But despite his best efforts to blend in with his fellow recruits, Marcus's differences hadn't gone unnoticed. In the highly competitive environment of basic training, where young men and women were pushed to their physical and mental limits while learning to function as a cohesive unit, any sign of weakness or inability to meet standards was quickly identified by both instructors and peers. Marcus's bunk was located in the middle of a long barracks bay that housed 40 recruits from his training company. His closest neighbors were Jeremy Walsh, a 19-year-old from rural Montana who had enlisted to escape a family farming operation that was struggling financially, and Antonio Rivera, an 18-year-old from Phoenix whose older brother had been killed while serving in Afghanistan, and who had joined the army to honor his sibling's memory. Both Walsh and Rivera were natural athletes who had excelled at sports in high school and were finding the physical demands of basic training to be challenging but manageable. They had noticed Marcus's slight limp from the beginning and had initially been sympathetic, assuming it was a temporary condition that would improve as he adjusted to the rigorous training schedule. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now, back to the story. But as the weeks had passed and Marcus's gait hadn't improved, their sympathy had begun to shift toward concern about whether he belonged in their unit. In the brotherhood of military service, where soldiers depended on each other for their very survival, the ability of every team member to meet physical and mental challenges was seen as essential for the safety and effectiveness of the entire group. The culture of basic training was designed to identify and eliminate recruits who couldn't meet the demanding standards required for military service. Drill instructors deliberately created high-stress situations that tested not only physical capabilities, but also mental resilience, teamwork skills, and the ability to perform under pressure. Recruits who couldn't keep up with the pace, who showed signs of being unable to handle the stress, or who demonstrated that they might be a liability to their fellow soldiers, were systematically removed from the program. In this environment, Marcus's visible struggle to match the physical performance of his peers was becoming increasingly problematic. It's not because his performance was inadequate by objective standards, but because it stood out in a system designed to create uniformity and mutual confidence among soldiers who would eventually trust each other with their lives. The irony of his situation was that Marcus possessed exactly the kind of character, traits that the military valued most highly: courage under pressure, willingness to sacrifice for others, and the ability to maintain focus and make sound decisions during crisis situations. But these qualities were invisible to his fellow recruits, who could only see the surface manifestation of his injury and had no knowledge of the experiences that had shaped his character and led him to military service. As Marcus stood in formation on this particular morning, feeling the familiar ache in his ankle and working to maintain the rigid posture required during the daily ceremony, he had no way of knowing that the events about to unfold would force him to confront not only the prejudices of his fellow recruits, but also his own assumptions about what it meant to earn respect through military service. The small metal pin hidden beneath his shirt, a Purple Heart that he had never mentioned to anyone at Fort Brennan, told a story that would soon transform his standing among his peers and teach everyone present a lesson about the difference between visible strength and true courage. But for now, Marcus simply focused on standing straight, keeping his weight evenly distributed despite the pain, and maintaining the military bearing that was expected of every soldier in formation. Regardless of the personal challenges they might be facing, the trouble began during the 4th week of training, when Drill Sergeant Hayes introduced a new element to their daily routine: competitive squad exercises designed to foster unit cohesion. While identifying natural leaders among the recruits, the company was divided into 8-person squads, each tasked with completing a series of physical and mental challenges that would be scored against the other teams. The winning squad each week would receive privileges like extended phone time or additional recreational activities, while the losing squad would face extra duties and remedial training. Marcus found himself assigned to Squad Charlie, along with 7 other recruits whose personalities and backgrounds represented a cross-section of young America. Leading the squad was Tyler Jameson, 21-year-old from Dallas whose father had served as a Marine Corps colonel and whose entire identity seemed built around proving that he was worthy of his family's military legacy. Jameson stood 6 feet 2 inches tall, possessed the kind of natural athleticism that made every physical challenge look effortless, and spoke with the confident authority of someone who had been groomed for leadership since childhood. Jameson's second in command was Derek Patterson, a 19-year-old from rural Alabama who had been the star quarterback of his high school football team before enlisting to pay for college. Patterson brought the same competitive intensity to military training that had made him successful in sports, viewing every exercise as a contest to be won rather than simply a skill to be learned. His broad shoulders and quick reflexes made him a natural choice for physically demanding tasks, and his Southern charm helped him build alliances with other recruits who might otherwise have challenged his authority. The 3rd member of their squad was Kevin Murphy, an 18-year-old from Boston whose older brothers had both served in the Army and who felt enormous pressure to live up to their achievements. Murphy was smaller in stature than Jameson or Patterson, but he compensated for his size with an aggressive attitude and a sharp tongue that he used to deflect attention from his own insecurities. He had quickly aligned himself with the squad's stronger personalities, adopting their attitudes and amplifying their opinions in an effort to secure his position within the group's hierarchy. Rounding out the squad were 4 other recruits: Brian Foster from Michigan, who had enlisted after losing his job at an automotive plant; Carlos Mendoza from Texas, whose family had a 3-generation tradition of military service; Jake Thompson from Oregon, who had joined the Army to gain structure and direction after struggling with substance abuse issues; and Michael Davis from Florida, who had enlisted to escape a troubled family situation and build a better life for himself. Each of these young men brought their own motivations, fears, and expectations to their military training. For some, like Mendoza and Murphy, military service represented the continuation of family traditions and the opportunity to prove themselves worthy of respect that had been earned by previous generations. For others, like Foster and Thompson, the Army offered a chance for personal redemption and the possibility of building skills and discipline that could lead to better opportunities in civilian life. But despite their different backgrounds and motivations, they shared certain characteristics that made them typical of their generation and social class. They had grown up in an era of relative peace and prosperity, where military service was voluntary and the realities of combat were known primarily through movies, video games, and news reports about distant conflicts that didn't directly affect their daily lives. Their understanding of military tradition and honor was largely theoretical, based on stories they had heard rather than experiences they had lived. More importantly, they possessed the kind of youthful confidence that made them quick to judge others based on surface appearances and immediate impressions. In the highly competitive environment of basic training, where every interaction was viewed through the lens of who was strong enough to be trusted in a crisis, Marcus's visible struggle with physical tasks made him an easy target for criticism and doubt. The first major incident occurred during a squad-based obstacle course exercise designed to test teamwork and individual performance under pressure. The course consisted of 8 stations, each requiring different combinations of strength, agility, and problem-solving skills. Teams were scored based on their overall completion time, with penalties added for any team member who failed to complete a station successfully. Marcus had trained extensively to prepare for such challenges, working with physical therapists to develop techniques that would allow him to navigate obstacles despite his ankle injury. He had learned to use upper body strength to compensate for limitations in his left leg, to time his movements carefully to avoid putting maximum stress on his weak ankle, and to push through pain when necessary to complete required tasks. But preparation was one thing, and performance under the scrutiny of competitive teammates was another. As Squad Charlie moved through the obstacle course, Marcus found himself struggling to keep pace with his more naturally athletic teammates. At the rope climb station, he had to work harder than the others to maintain his grip, while his injured ankle made it difficult to use proper climbing technique. During the wall traverse, his inability to trust his left leg completely forced him to rely more heavily on his arms, slowing his progress and causing him to fall behind the group's rhythm. The most challenging obstacle was a series of tire runs that required precise footwork and the ability to maintain balance while moving quickly through a pattern of tires laid flat on the ground. For recruits with full mobility, the exercise was demanding but manageable. For Marcus, each step required careful calculation to ensure that his weight distribution wouldn't cause his ankle to buckle or send shooting pain up his leg that might cause him to stumble. Tyler Jameson was the first to voice his frustration. As the squad gathered after completing the course with a time that placed them 4th out of 8 teams, he made no effort to hide his displeasure with their performance. "We could have won this thing if everyone had pulled their weight," he said, his eyes fixed pointedly on Marcus. "Some of us are here to be soldiers, and some of us are apparently here to hold back the team." Derek Patterson nodded in agreement, his competitive instincts inflamed by their failure to achieve first place. "I don't understand how someone gets through the medical screening if they can't handle basic physical requirements," he said. "This isn't supposed to be a rehabilitation program for people with disabilities." Kevin Murphy, eager to align himself with the squad's dominant personalities, was quick to add his own criticism. "My brothers told me that basic training was supposed to weed out people who couldn't cut it," he said. "Maybe the standards gotten too easy if people can make it through with obvious physical problems." Marcus felt his face burning with embarrassment and anger, but he had learned from his search and rescue training that responding defensively to criticism often made situations worse rather than better. Instead, he tried to address their concerns directly and honestly. "I know I'm not the fastest on some of these exercises," he said, "but I'm meeting all the minimum standards, and I'm working harder than anyone to improve my performance." Jameson's response revealed the depth of his privilege and the assumptions that shaped his worldview. "Working hard isn't the same as being effective," he said. "In combat, the enemy doesn't care how hard you're trying. They care about results. If you can't keep up during training, how are we supposed to trust you when lives are on the line?" The irony of Jameson's comment was lost on everyone present except Marcus, who understood better than any of them what it meant to make life-and-death decisions under pressure. But explaining his background would have required revealing details about his civilian rescue work and the circumstances that had led to his injury. Information that he preferred to keep private rather than risk being seen as someone who was trying to gain sympathy or special treatment. Over the following days, criticism from his squad mates intensified as they faced additional competitive exercises that highlighted Marcus's physical limitations. During early morning runs, he consistently finished in the middle of the pack despite pushing himself to his absolute limits, a performance that his teammates interpreted as lack of effort rather than evidence of someone working harder than anyone else to achieve acceptable results. The situation was complicated by the fact that Marcus's compensation techniques, developed through months of physical therapy, were often misinterpreted by observers who didn't understand the nature of his injury. When he favored his right leg during long marches, his teammates assumed he was being lazy rather than protecting an ankle that could buckle without warning. When he used modified techniques during calisthenics exercises, they saw someone who was unwilling to follow standard procedures rather than someone who had learned alternative methods to achieve the same results despite physical limitations. Brian Foster, who had initially been sympathetic to Marcus's struggles, began to distance himself as the squad's criticism intensified. "I feel bad for the guy," he confided to Carlos Mendoza one evening as they cleaned their equipment. "But Jameson's right about one thing. We're all going to depend on each other someday, and I need to know that the person next to me can handle whatever comes up." Mendoza, whose family's military tradition had taught him to value strength and reliability above personal feelings, nodded in agreement. "My grandfather always said that the army isn't a place for sympathy," he said. "Either you can do the job or you can't. There's no middle ground when people's lives are at stake." Jake Thompson, who was struggling with his own demons related to his past substance abuse, found in Marcus a convenient target for projecting his own fears about not being strong enough for military service. "At least my problems are behind me," he told Michael Davis. "I made mistakes, but I fixed them. Chen's problem is something he's always going to have to deal with. How is that fair to the rest of us?" Michael Davis, the youngest member of the squad at 17, had enlisted to escape family problems that had made him mature beyond his years, but his youth showed in his tendency to follow the lead of older, more confident personalities rather than forming his own judgments about complex situations. "Maybe he should have waited until he was completely healed before enlisting," he suggested. "It seems selfish to expect everyone else to accommodate his limitations." The squad's growing animosity toward Marcus was exacerbated by the the structure of their training program, which pits squads against each other in daily exercises and weekly evaluations. Every point lost due to slower performance or modified technique was seen as a direct threat to the group's standing and their chances of earning privileges or avoiding extra duties. In an environment where collective success was prioritized over individual achievement, Marcus's struggles were perceived as betrayals of the team rather than personal challenges to be overcome. Tyler Jameson emerged as the most vocal critic, using his natural leadership abilities and family military background to position himself as the voice of military tradition and standards. "This isn't about being mean to someone who's different," he explained to the other squad members during an informal gathering in the barracks. "This is about maintaining the integrity of an institution that depends on every person being able to meet the same high standards." His arguments carried particular weight because they echoed themes that the recruits heard daily from their drill instructors about the importance of excellence, the need for reliability, and the life and death consequences of military service. Jameson was skilled at wrapping his personal frustration and competitive disappointment in language that sounded like principled concern for military effectiveness. Derek Patterson provided enthusiastic support for Jameson's position, adding his own sports-based perspective on team dynamics and performance standards. "In football, if someone can't keep up, they get cut from the team," he said. "It's not personal, it's just reality. The military should work the same way. There's too much at stake, too lower standards for anyone." Kevin Murphy, desperate to maintain his position within the group's hierarchy, became increasingly aggressive in his criticism of Marcus, often making comments that crossed the line from professional concern into personal attack. "Maybe he should consider a different career path," Murphy suggested during one particularly heated discussion. "There are plenty of ways to serve your country that don't require physical fitness. He could work for the government as a civilian or something." The psychological pressure of constant criticism and social isolation was taking its toll on Marcus, who found himself questioning his decision to pursue military service despite his injury. The confidence he had gained from his civilian rescue work seemed irrelevant in an environment where his teammates saw only weakness and liability. His careful preparation and modified techniques were dismissed as inadequate substitutes for natural ability, and his determination to succeed despite obstacles was interpreted as stubborn refusal to acknowledge his limitations. But Marcus possessed something that his critics couldn't see: the psychological resilience that had been forged during 4 hours on a mountain ledge, keeping another person alive while emergency responders worked to reach their location. He had learned that true strength wasn't measured by the absence of fear or pain, but by the ability to function effectively despite both. The experience of making life-and-death decisions under extreme pressure had taught him that character was revealed not in moments of ease and comfort, but in situations where everything was on the line and failure meant catastrophic consequences for others. As the conflict with his squad mates intensified, Marcus drew on these inner resources to maintain his focus on the larger goal of completing his training and earning the right to serve his country in uniform. He refused to be drawn into arguments that would only escalate tensions, continued to work harder than anyone else to improve his performance, and maintained his military bearing even when faced with increasingly personal attacks on his character and suitability for service. The stage was set for a confrontation that would test not only Marcus's resolve, but also force his squad mates to confront their own assumptions about strength, service, and what it truly meant to earn the right to wear the uniform of a United States soldier. The situation reached a new level of intensity. During the 5th week of training, when Drill Sergeant Hayes announced that the company would be participating in a field training exercise designed to simulate real combat conditions, the 3-day event would take place in the pine forests surrounding Fort Brennan, where recruits would be required to navigate challenging terrain while carrying full combat loads, establish defensive positions under time pressure, and demonstrate their ability to function as cohesive units during extended operations away from the comfortable routine of barracks life. For Marcus, the field exercise represented both an opportunity to prove himself and a significant physical challenge that would test his ability to perform military tasks under the most demanding conditions he had yet faced. The prospect of carrying a 60-pound rucksack over rough terrain for extended periods filled him with both determination and anxiety, knowing that any visible struggle would provide additional ammunition for his critics within Squad Charlie. The announcement of the field exercise also marked the beginning of a systematic campaign by Tyler Jamison to document and publicize what he characterized as Marcus's inability to meet basic military standards. Jamison began keeping a mental catalog of every instance where Marcus appeared to struggle, every modified technique he used to compensate for his ankle injury, and every moment where his performance fell short of what Jamison considered acceptable for a future soldier. "We need to think about this from a leadership perspective," Jamison explained to the other squad members during their evening equipment preparation. "If Chen can't handle a 3-day field exercise and training, what happens when we're deployed? Somewhere that really matters? Do we just hope that the enemy gives him accommodations for his disability?" Derek Patterson had become increasingly vocal in his support of Jamison's position, using his background in competitive sports to frame Marcus's limitations as a betrayal of team principles. "In football, you play hurt or you don't play at all," he said, while adjusting the straps on his field gear. "There's no participation trophy for trying your best when your best isn't good enough to help the team win." Kevin Murphy, emboldened by the approval he received from the squad's dominant personalities, had begun making increasingly personal comments about Marcus's character and motivations. "I think he's selfish," Murphy declared while organizing his equipment. "He knows he can't keep up, but he's willing to put all of us at risk just so he can say he made it through basic training. That's not an honor, it's ego." The evening before the field exercise began, the tension within Squad Charlie reached a boiling point during what started as a routine discussion about equipment distribution and tactical assignments. The squad was gathered in a corner of the barracks, reviewing maps and discussing their planned approach to the various challenges they would face during the upcoming exercise. Marcus had spent hours studying the terrain maps and had developed what he believed were sound tactical suggestions, based on his civilian experience with wilderness navigation and his understanding of how to move efficiently through difficult terrain despite physical limitations. But when he attempted to contribute to the squad's planning session, his ideas were dismissed with increasing hostility. "Look, Chen," Jamison said, his voice carrying the authority he had assumed as the squad's unofficial leader, "we appreciate that you want to help, but we need to be realistic about what you can and can't contribute to this exercise. Maybe it would be better if you focused on keeping up, rather than trying to make tactical decisions for people who don't have your limitations." The comment stung because it revealed how completely his squad mates had written him off as a tactical asset. Marcus's extensive experience with wilderness rescue operations had given him sophisticated understanding of terrain analysis, risk assessment, and efficient movement through challenging environments. He had successfully navigated situations that were far more complex and dangerous than anything they would face during their training exercise. But his teammates saw only his physical limitations and assumed that these somehow translated into mental or tactical inadequacy. "I understand that you have concerns about my physical performance," Marcus replied, working to keep his voice level and professional. "But my suggestions are based on solid tactical principles and practical experience with this type of terrain. I think we should evaluate ideas based on their merit rather than who's proposing them." Derek Patterson's response revealed the depth of frustration that had been building within the squad over the past several weeks. "Experience with what terrain?" he challenged. "Hiking trails in California. This is military training, not a nature walk. There's a difference between civilian activities and real military operations." The irony of Patterson's comment was particularly sharp, given that his own military experience consisted entirely of the 5 weeks of basic training they had all completed together. But Marcus recognized that pointing out this inconsistency would only escalate tensions without addressing the underlying issues that were driving the conflict. Carlos Mendoza, who had been silent during most of the planning discussion, finally spoke up with comments that reflected his family's military tradition and his own expectations about what constituted appropriate military behavior. "In my family, we have a saying that you earn respect through performance, not through talk," he said. "Maybe we should focus on completing the mission rather than debating who has the best ideas." Brian Foster, who had been growing increasingly uncomfortable with the squad's treatment of Marcus, attempted to mediate the situation with a suggestion that acknowledged everyone's concerns while trying to maintain unit cohesion. "Maybe we're overthinking this," he said. "We're all on the same team here. Let's just focus on working together and supporting each other during the exercise." But Jake Thompson, whose own insecurities about his past problems had made him eager to identify someone else as the squad's weak link, rejected Foster's attempt at reconciliation. "Supporting each other doesn't mean pretending that problems don't exist," he said. "If someone can't pull their weight, that affects all of us. Have a right to expect that everyone in this squad can meet the same standards." Michael Davis, the youngest member of the squad, had been observing the escalating conflict with the wide-eyed fascination of someone watching his first experience with serious interpersonal drama. His youth and inexperience made him particularly susceptible to the confident assertions of older squad members, and he had gradually adopted their perspective without really understanding the complexities of the situation. "Maybe Chen should talk to the drill sergeants about getting reassigned to a different squad," Davis suggested with the casual cruelty that sometimes marked teenage attempts to solve complex problems. That way he could find people who are more at his level, and we could focus on excelling instead of just trying to get everyone through. The suggestion that Marcus should voluntarily remove himself from the squad crystallized the extent to which his teammates had written him off as a liability rather than recognizing him as someone who was working harder than any of them to meet military standards despite significant personal challenges. The recommendation also revealed their fundamental misunderstanding of military culture, which emphasized loyalty, perseverance, and mutual support rather than abandoning teammates who were struggling. Marcus felt a surge of anger that he struggled to control, but his response demonstrated the emotional discipline that had been forged during crisis situations where maintaining composure was essential for making sound decisions. "I'm not going anywhere," he said quietly. "I earned my place in this squad the same way everyone else did. I'll complete this training exercise with the same commitment to excellence that I bring to everything else." Tyler Jameson's reaction to Marcus's assertion of his right to remain with the squad revealed the privileged mindset that had shaped his entire approach to military service. "Earning your place once doesn't give you the right to keep it if you can't maintain standards," he said. "Military service isn't about individual rights. It's about collective effectiveness and mission accomplishment." The conversation was interrupted by the arrival of Drill Sergeant Hayes, who had come to conduct a final inspection of the squad's equipment and provide last-minute instructions for the field exercise. Hayes was a career soldier with 15 years of active duty experience, including multiple deployments to Afghanistan and Iraq, but volunteered for drill sergeant duty as a way of passing on his knowledge and experience to the next generation. Of soldiers, Hayes possessed the kind of practical wisdom that came from actual combat experience, and he had observed the developing tensions within squad. Charlie, with the understanding of someone who had seen how interpersonal conflicts could affect unit performance under stress. He had also noticed Marcus's struggles and his teammates' reactions. But his assessment of the situation was informed by years of experience with soldiers who had overcome various challenges to serve effectively. "Gentlemen," Hayes said, as he began his inspection of their gear, "tomorrow, you're going to face some challenges that will test not just your individual abilities, but your capacity to function as a team under difficult conditions. Military effectiveness depends on every soldier being able to count on the others. But it also depends on recognizing that different people bring different strengths to the mission." The drill sergeant's comments were delivered in the neutral tone that marked professional military instruction. But Marcus detected a subtle emphasis that suggested Hayes was aware of the squad's internal dynamics and was providing guidance that went beyond simple tactical preparation. As Hayes moved through the squad conducting his equipment inspection, he paused at Marcus's station with what appeared to be routine professional attention. "Chen," he said, examining the modifications Marcus had made to his gear to accommodate his physical limitations. "I see you've made some adjustments to your load distribution. Explain your reasoning." Marcus's response demonstrated both his technical knowledge and his understanding of how to adapt standard procedures to achieve optimal results despite physical constraints. "Drill Sergeant, I've shifted some weight from the lower portion of my pack to reduce stress on my ankle joint while maintaining proper balance and accessibility of essential equipment. The modifications are within regulation parameters and designed to maintain or improve my operational effectiveness." Hayes nodded approvingly, recognizing both the sophistication of Marcus's approach and his commitment to finding solutions rather than making excuses. "Good thinking, Chen. Adaptation and problem-solving are essential military skills. Carry on." Drill Sergeant's implicit approval of Marcus's modifications sent a clear message to the rest of the squad about the difference between professional, military standards and the personal prejudices that had been driving their criticism. But rather than recognizing this as an opportunity to reconsider their attitudes, several squad members interpreted Hayes's comments as evidence that Marcus was receiving special treatment that compromised the integrity of their training. After Hayes departed, Tyler Jameson immediately voiced his interpretation of the interaction in terms that revealed his fundamental misunderstanding of military leadership and adaptability. "Did you see that?" he said to the other squad members. "Chen gets praised for modifying his equipment while the rest of us have to follow standard procedures. How is that fair or equal treatment?" Derek Patterson's response demonstrated how competitive personalities could distort military values when they conflicted with personal desires for recognition and status. "If we all started modifying our gear to make things easier, where would it end?" he asked. "The whole point of military training is learning to operate within established parameters, not creating custom solutions for individual problems, Kevin." Murphy, eager to maintain his position within the squad's hierarchy, offered his own interpretation that characterized Marcus's adaptations as evidence of moral weakness rather than tactical innovation. "It's like he's looking for shortcuts while the rest of us are doing things the hard way," he said. "That's not the kind of attitude you want in a soldier who's supposed to have your back in combat." The criticism from his squad mates was particularly frustrating for Marcus because it reflected their complete misunderstanding of both his motivations and his methods. The equipment modifications he had developed were the result of extensive consultation with physical therapists, military medical personnel, and experienced soldiers who understood that effective military service often required creative problem-solving, rather than rigid adherence to one-size-fits-all procedures. More importantly, the suggestion that he was looking for easy solutions ignored the fact that he was working significantly harder than any of his teammates to achieve comparable results. Every training exercise required him to overcome pain, compensate for physical limitations, and maintain performance standards. While dealing with constant criticism from people who had never faced comparable challenges as the squad settled in. For their final night before the field exercise, the atmosphere in their section of the barracks was thick with tension and unresolved conflict. Marcus lay in his bunk, staring at the ceiling and drawing on the inner resources that had sustained him during the most difficult moments of his civilian rescue work. He thought about Sarah Martinez, alone and injured on that mountain ledge, and how his willingness to stay with her, despite personal risk, had made the difference between life and death. Tomorrow's field exercise would test not only his physical capabilities, but also his psychological resilience in the face of teammates who seemed determined to see him fail. But Marcus carried with him something that none of his critics possessed: the knowledge that he had already proven himself under conditions far more challenging than anything basic training could provide, and the quiet confidence that came from understanding the difference between surface appearances and fundamental character. The small medal, pin hidden beneath his undershirt, represented recognition of courage under fire that his squadmates couldn't imagine, earned through actions that had saved lives and prevented a tragedy that would have devastated multiple families. Tomorrow, the question would be whether his teammates were capable of recognizing true strength when it didn't match their preconceptions about what military excellence looked like. The first day of the field training exercise began at 0400 hours, with a forced march that would take Squad Charlie 8 miles through dense pine forest to their designated bivouac area. Each recruit carried a fully loaded rucksack weighing 65 pounds, along with their weapon, ammunition, water, and specialized equipment assigned to their role within the squad. The route had been carefully selected by the training cadre to include stream crossings, steep hills, and sections of rough terrain that would test both individual endurance and unit cohesion under physically demanding conditions. Marcus had prepared extensively for this moment, modifying his load distribution and developing a pacing strategy that would allow him to complete the march. While managing the chronic pain in his ankle, he had worked with the base physical therapist to design exercises that would strengthen the muscles around his injury, and had practiced walking with heavy loads until he could maintain proper form despite the discomfort that shot up his leg. With each step, but preparation could only do so much when faced with the reality of moving through challenging terrain while carrying military equipment that had been designed for soldiers without physical limitations. Within the first mile, Marcus found himself working significantly harder than his squadmates to maintain the pace set by Tyler Jameson, who had positioned himself at the front of the formation and was pushing the group forward with the aggressive enthusiasm of someone eager to demonstrate his superior fitness. The early morning darkness made the terrain even more treacherous, requiring careful attention to foot placement and balance while navigating roots, rocks, and uneven ground that could easily cause a stumble or fall. For Marcus, each step required conscious calculation to ensure that his weight distribution wouldn't put excessive stress on his weak ankle or cause the sharp pain that could throw off his rhythm and create a gap in the formation. Derek Patterson, marching directly behind Marcus, quickly noticed the subtle irregularities in his gait and began providing a running commentary that was clearly intended to highlight Marcus's struggles for the benefit of the other squad members. "Come on, Chen," Patterson called out in a stage whisper that carried clearly through the morning air. "We're barely a mile in, and you're already falling behind." This is exactly what we were talking about. Kevin Murphy, eager to participate in what he saw as justified criticism of someone who was compromising the squad's performance, added his own observations with the cruel satisfaction of someone who had found a socially acceptable target for his frustrations. "Maybe we should have brought a wheelchair," he suggested with mock helpfulness. "Or better yet, maybe Chen should have stayed back at the barracks where he belongs." The comments were particularly stinging because they came during a moment when Marcus was pushing himself beyond his normal limits, enduring significant pain while working to maintain his position within the formation. His ankle felt like it was being stabbed with each step, and the additional weight of his rucksack was creating pressure points that would leave bruises and soreness for days after the exercise ended. But Marcus had learned during his civilian Rescue worked at the most dangerous moment in any crisis was when pain and fatigue began to cloud judgment and decision-making. He forced himself to maintain his mental focus, using breathing techniques and visualization methods that had helped him survive for hours on a mountain ledge, while keeping another person alive. The criticism from his squad mates was just another environmental factor to be managed. Like bad weather or difficult terrain, Carlos Mendoza, who had been silently observing the interaction between Marcus and his critics, finally spoke up with a comment that reflected his family's military tradition and his understanding of how unit dynamics could affect overall performance. "Maybe we should save the commentary for after we complete the mission," he suggested. It's kind of chatter. "Isn't helping anyone maintain focus or conserve energy?" But Jake Thompson, whose own insecurities made him eager to deflect attention from his struggles with the physical demands of the march, rejected Mendoza's suggestion in favor of continuing the attack on Marcus. "The problem isn't commentary," he said, breathing heavily as he adjusted his pack straps. "The problem is having someone in the squad who can't keep up with basic military standards. That affects all of us." Brian Foster, who had been growing increasingly uncomfortable with the squad's treatment of Marcus, attempted to redirect the conversation toward more constructive topics. "We've got 7 more miles to go," he pointed out. "Maybe we should focus on pacing ourselves and working together instead of arguing about who's struggling." Michael Davis, the youngest squad member, had been listening to the exchange with the fascination of someone experiencing his first taste of serious interpersonal conflict. His youth and inexperience made him particularly susceptible to the confident assertions of older squad members. But he was also beginning to recognize that there might be more complexity to the situation than he had initially understood. The march continued through increasingly difficult terrain as the sun rose and the temperature began to climb. The pine forest provided some shade, but the humidity and the weight of their equipment made every step a test of endurance and determination. Stream crossings required careful coordination to ensure that everyone made it across safely while keeping their equipment dry. And steep hills demanded the kind of sustained effort that revealed the true extent of each recruit's physical conditioning. Marcus found himself drawing on reserves of mental strength that he had developed during his most challenging civilian rescue operations. The pain in his ankle had become a constant companion, but he had learned to compartmentalize physical discomfort and maintain operational effectiveness despite adverse conditions. His experience with wilderness medicine had taught him to monitor his body for signs of serious injury. While pushing through temporary pain that was uncomfortable but not dangerous, the critical moment came during the 4th hour of the march, when the squad encountered a particularly steep section of trail that required scrambling over loose rocks and fallen logs. The terrain was challenging even for recruits with full mobility, requiring careful attention to hand and foot placement while maintaining balance under the weight of a heavy pack. Marcus approached the obstacle with the systematic analysis that had served him well during technical rescue operations. He identified the safest route, planned his movements to minimize stress on his ankle, and began the ascent with the measured pace that had become his trademark. But as he navigated the most difficult section of the climb, his compensation techniques became more obvious to his squad mates, who interpreted his careful movements as evidence of weakness rather than tactical skill. Tyler Jameson, who had completed the climb with the natural athleticism that made every physical challenge look effortless, positioned himself at the top of the obstacle and began providing loud encouragement that was clearly designed to embarrass Marcus rather than help him. "Come on, Chen," called out in a voice that carried to the other squads moving through the area. "You can do it. Just pretend you're a real soldier." The comment drew attention from recruits and other squads who paused in their own movements to observe what was clearly becoming a public spectacle. Marcus felt his face burning with embarrassment, but he maintained his focus on completing the climb safely rather than responding to the provocation. He understood that any defensive reaction would only provide additional ammunition for his critics and might compromise his ability to navigate the remaining obstacles. Derek Patterson, emboldened by Jameson's public mockery, added his own commentary. With the cruel enthusiasm of someone who had found a socially acceptable outlet for his competitive frustrations. "This is taking forever," he announced to anyone within hearing distance. "We're going to be here all day, waiting for him to figure out how to climb over a few rocks." The attention from other squads was particularly humiliating because it transformed what should have been an internal squad matter into a public demonstration of what Marcus's teammates characterized as his inadequacy. Recruits from neighboring squads began pointing and whispering among themselves, clearly discussing the spectacle of someone who appeared to be struggling with basic military tasks. Kevin Murphy, sensing an opportunity to gain social capital through public cruelty, escalated the situation with a comment that crossed the line from professional criticism into personal attack. "Maybe we should leave him behind," he called out loud enough for multiple squads to hear. "He's obviously not cut out for this kind of work." The suggestion that the squad should abandon one of its members violated fundamental military principles about loyalty and mutual support. But Murphy's comment was greeted with laughter from some observers who interpreted the situation as harmless. Teasing rather than systematic bullying of someone who was working harder than anyone else to meet military standards, Marcus completed the climb with the same methodical approach that had characterized his entire performance, but the public humiliation had taken a psychological toll that went beyond simple embarrassment. For the first time since beginning his military training, he found himself questioning whether his decision to enlist had been a mistake that was causing problems. Not just for himself, but for everyone around him. The doubt was particularly troubling, because it represented a fundamental shift in his self-perception. Throughout his civilian rescue work, Marcus had developed confidence in his ability to contribute meaningfully to challenging operations. Despite physical limitations, he had earned the respect of experienced rescue professionals who valued his tactical thinking, his psychological resilience, his willingness to take calculated risks to help others. But military training operated according to different social dynamics, where visible conformity was often valued more highly than individual innovation, and where peer acceptance was essential for psychological well-being. The constant criticism from his squad mates was beginning to erode the confidence that had sustained him through far more dangerous situations, replacing it with self-doubt that could compromise his performance in ways that actual physical limitations never had. The march continued for 3 more hours, with Marcus maintaining his position within the formation despite increasing fatigue and the psychological pressure of constant scrutiny from his teammates. He had learned to block out their commentary and focus on the immediate tasks of navigation, pace management, and equipment maintenance that were essential for completing the mission successfully. But the real test came when the squad reached their designated bivouac area and began the process of establishing a defensive perimeter and setting up their temporary camp. The site was located on rough terrain that required extensive preparation. Before it could accommodate 8 soldiers and their equipment for 2 nights, trees needed to be cleared, fighting positions had to be dug, and camouflage had to be installed to conceal their location from the opposing force that would be conducting reconnaissance and harassment operations throughout the exercise. Marcus approached the camp construction tasks with the same systematic methodology that had characterized his entire military training experience. His background in wilderness operations had given him a sophisticated understanding of site selection, resource management, and efficient work organization. He had experience with the kind of improvised engineering that was required to create functional living and working spaces in challenging environments. But when he attempted to contribute his knowledge and experience to the squad's planning process, his suggestions were met with the same dismissive hostility that had marked their interactions throughout the training cycle. Tyler Jameson, still flushed with the satisfaction of publicly humiliating Marcus during the climb, was particularly aggressive in rejecting any input from someone he had characterized as a liability to the squad's effectiveness. "Chen, why don't you just focus on keeping up with your assigned tasks instead of trying to manage everyone else's work?" Jameson suggested with patronizing condescension. "We've got this handled by people who don't need special accommodations to do their jobs." The comment was particularly unfair because Marcus had consistently completed all assigned tasks despite his physical limitations. often working longer hours and using more creative approaches than his squad mates to achieve the same results. His suggestions about camp organization were based on practical experience and technical knowledge that exceeded anything his teammates possessed. But they were rejected based solely on personal prejudice rather than merit. Derek Patterson, eager to support Jameson's assertion of leadership, added his own criticism with the confidence of someone who had never been tested by real adversity. "This isn't a civilian hiking trip where everyone gets to share their opinions," he said. "This is military training, and military training requires following orders from people who are qualified to give them." The irony of Patterson's comment was that his own military qualifications consisted entirely of the same 5 weeks of basic training that they had all completed together. Marcus possessed years of experience with the kind of tactical problem-solving that was essential for successful military operations. But pointing out this discrepancy would have required revealing details about his civilian background that Marcus preferred to keep private. As the afternoon progressed and the squad worked to complete their camp construction tasks, the psychological pressure on Marcus continued to intensify. Every movement was scrutinized for signs of weakness. Every technique was criticized as evidence of his inability to meet standard military procedures. And every attempt to contribute was rejected as presumptuous overreach by someone who hadn't earned the right to offer opinions. The breaking point came just as the sun was setting and the squad was conducting final preparations for the night defense. Marcus was adjusting his fighting position to provide better fields of fire while accounting for the limitations imposed by his ankle injury when his careful movements caught the attention of Kevin Murphy, who had been looking for opportunities to demonstrate his alignment with the squad's dominant personalities. "Look at Chen trying to dig his foxhole," Murphy announced to the other squad members with cruel amusement. "Even sitting in a hole in the ground, he can't figure out how to look like a soldier." The comment was the culmination of a day filled with public humiliation, systematic rejection, and constant criticism from people whose own military experience was limited to the same training program they were all completing together. But more than that, it represented a fundamental misunderstanding of what military service meant and what kind of character was required to serve effectively under challenging conditions. Marcus felt something snap inside him, not the explosive anger that might have led to a confrontation, but rather a cold clarity about the situation he was facing and the choices that lay ahead. He was surrounded by people who were so focused on surface appearances that they couldn't recognize genuine military virtues when they saw them. People who confused physical perfection with character strength and who had never been tested by the kind of circumstances that revealed what someone was truly made of. But as Marcus prepared to respond to the latest insult, his reflection was interrupted by the sound of a vehicle approaching their bivouac area. Through the gathering darkness, he could see the headlights of a military Humvee navigating the rough trail that led to their position. The arrival of any vehicle during a field training exercise was unusual enough to draw attention from all squad members. But there was something about the approaching lights that suggested this wasn't a routine logistics run or medical check. As the vehicle drew closer, Marcus could make out the silhouette of multiple occupants and the outline of radio antennas that indicated this was a command vehicle carrying senior personnel. The unexpected arrival of what appeared to be high-ranking visitors during their field exercise created a moment of uncertainty that temporarily paused the ongoing conflict within. Squad Charlie. What none of them knew was that the approaching vehicle carried news that would transform their understanding of everything they thought they knew about military service, heroism, and the true meaning of strength under fire. The events about to unfold would force every member of Squad Charlie to confront their assumptions about what made someone worthy of wearing the uniform of a United States soldier. The military Humvee came to a stop at the edge of Squad Charlie's bivouac area, its diesel engine idling as three figures emerged from the vehicle with the unmistakable bearing of senior military officers. Even in the gathering darkness, their silhouettes conveyed the kind of authority that came from decades of service and command responsibility. The lead figure was tall and distinguished, moving with the measured confidence of someone accustomed to being the most important person in any room he entered. Drill Sergeant Hayes appeared immediately, having been monitoring radio traffic about the unexpected arrival of what his communications indicated was a very high-level inspection team. Hayes jogged toward the vehicle with the crisp efficiency that marked professional non-commissioned officers. His own 15 years of experience suddenly, seeming modest compared to the rank structure that was about to visit his training area. "General Blackwood on deck," Hayes called out in a voice that carried across the entire bivouac area, causing every recruit within earshot to freeze in whatever task they had been performing. The announcement sent a shockwave through Squad Charlie and the neighboring units, as soldiers who had never seen a general officer outside of official ceremonies suddenly found themselves in the presence of military leadership at the highest levels. General Robert Blackwood stepped into the illumination provided by the squad's field lighting, revealing a man in his late 50s whose chest displayed ribbons and decorations that told the story of a career spent in the world's most challenging combat environments. His combat infantry badge, Ranger Tab, Special Forces qualification, indicated someone who had earned his rank through direct participation in the kind of operations that most soldiers only heard about in classified briefings. Accompanying General Blackwood were Colonel Sarah Mitchell, a logistics specialist whose expertise in supply chain management had revolutionized military operations in 3 different theaters of war. In command, Sergeant Major Williams, a career infantry soldier whose 30-year service record included deployments to every major conflict zone where American forces had operated since the Gulf War. The arrival of such senior leadership during a routine training exercise was unprecedented, and the recruits of Squad Charlie found themselves scrambling to present proper military courtesy while trying to understand why they had suddenly become the focus of attention from officers, whose names they had only heard mentioned in hushed, reverent tones. General Blackwood's presence commanded immediate respect through sheer force of personality and professional accomplishment. His voice, when he spoke, carried the quiet authority of someone who had made life-and-death decisions affecting thousands of soldiers and had earned the right to be heard without question. "Sergeant Hayes," General Blackwood said, returning the drill sergeant's salute with military precision, "I'm looking for recruit Marcus Chen. I understand he's assigned to one of your training squads." The mention of Marcus's name sent a ripple of confusion and apprehension through Squad Charlie. Tyler Jamison felt his stomach drop as he realized that someone of General Blackwood's stature had come specifically to find the recruit. He had spent the day publicly humiliating. Derek Patterson's face went pale as he contemplated the possibility that their treatment of Marcus might have somehow come to the attention of senior leadership Kevin Murphy, who had made the final cruel comment about Marcus's appearance in his appearance. Fighting Position suddenly found himself unable to meet anyone's eyes as the magnitude of their situation began to sink in. The recruit they had been systematically attacking and dismissing as unfit for military service was apparently important enough to warrant a personal visit from a 3-star general. "Yes," Drill Sergeant Hayes replied, his own confusion evident despite his professional demeanor. "Recruit Chen is assigned to Squad Charlie. Is there a specific issue that requires command attention?" General Blackwood's expression remained neutral, but those familiar with senior military leadership could detect the subtle signs of someone operating under the influence of strong emotions that were being carefully controlled through professional discipline. "Sergeant, I need to speak with Recruit Chen immediately. This is a matter of significant importance to the Department of the Army." Hayes turned toward Squad Charlie's position and called out with the authority that had shaped countless young soldiers during his career as a drill instructor. "Recruit Chen, front and center. Move with a purpose." Marcus emerged from his fighting position with the same careful movements that had characterized his entire training experience, favoring his right leg as he navigated the uneven ground while maintaining military bearing. His appearance in the harsh illumination of the field lights revealed a young man who had been pushed to his physical limits during the day's activities, but who maintained the kind of composed professionalism that marked soldiers who understood the importance of proper military courtesy. As Marcus approached the group of senior officers, General Blackwood studied him with the analytical gaze of someone assessing both his physical condition and his psychological state. The general's experienced eye immediately noted the subtle signs of favoring one leg, the careful way Marcus positioned his body to minimize stress on what was obviously an injury, and the quiet determination that marked someone who was accustomed to performing duties despite personal discomfort. "Recruit Chen, General Blackwood said, his voice carrying a warmth that contrasted sharply with the formal military setting. I'm General Blackwood, and I've come here tonight because there's something we need to discuss about your service record. Marcus felt his heart rate spike as he tried to process why a 3-star general would travel to a training area to speak with him personally. His mind raced through possibilities, wondering if somehow his civilian rescue activities had created complications for his military service, or if there had been some administrative error that required high-level intervention to resolve. Yes, sir, Marcus replied, his voice steady despite the confusion and anxiety that were building inside him. How can I be of assistance, General? Blackwood glanced at the assembled members of Squad Charlie who were standing in various states of attention while trying to process the unprecedented situation unfolding before them. Colonel Mitchell stepped forward with a leather portfolio that contained documents, bearing classification markings that indicated information far above the security clearance level of basic training recruits. Recruit Chen, Colonel Mitchell said, opening the portfolio to reveal official military paperwork. We've received some disturbing reports about your treatment during training. We've come to address what appears to be a significant misunderstanding about your background and qualifications. For military service, Tyler Jameson felt a cold chill run down his spine as he realized that their squad's internal dynamics had somehow come to the attention of senior military leadership. The possibility that his leadership of the campaign against Marcus might have been observed and reported filled him with a dread that was unlike anything he had experienced during his privileged upbringing. Command Sergeant Major Williams, whose decades of experience had taught him to read the dynamics of military units with extraordinary precision, surveyed Squad Charlie with the kind of analytical gaze that missed nothing. His assessment included not just Marcus's condition and bearing, but also the defensive postures and guilty expressions of his squad mates. Recruit Chen, General Blackwood continued, we understand that you've been experiencing some challenges with your fellow soldiers, related to a leg injury that occurred prior to your enlistment. Is this an accurate assessment of the situation? Found himself in an impossible position, caught between his desire to address the problems he had been facing and his understanding that military culture strongly discouraged complaints about peer relationships. His response demonstrated the kind of tactical thinking that had served him well during crisis situations. Sir, I have experienced some physical challenges related to an ankle injury, but I've been working to meet all training standards and fulfill my obligations to my squad and my unit, he said. I understand that my performance may not always meet the expectations of my fellow soldiers, but I'm committed to continuous improvement and mission accomplishment. The diplomatic nature of Marcus's response revealed both his maturity and his understanding of military protocol, but it also confirmed General Blackwood's suspicions about what had been happening during Squad Charlie's training cycle. The general's experience with military leadership had taught him to recognize when soldiers were protecting their units even at personal cost. Colonel Mitchell opened her portfolio to a specific document and began reading in the formal tone reserved. For official military communications, Recruit Chen, according to records maintained by the Department of Veterans Affairs, you are the recipient of the Purple Heart Medal, awarded for wounds received in action during a classified operation conducted in conjunction with federal emergency response agencies. The words hit Squad Charlie like an artillery shell, creating a moment of stunned silence as 8 young men tried to process information that completely contradicted everything they had assumed about their squad mate. Tyler Jameson felt his legs go weak as he realized that the recruit he had been publicly mocking for weakness was apparently a decorated combat veteran. Derek Patterson's face went ashen as the implications of Colonel Mitchell's statement began to sink in. The person he had dismissed as unfit for military service was not only qualified, but had already earned recognition for valor under fire. His competitive instincts, which had driven him to attack Marcus's performance, now seemed like the cruel ignorance of someone who had never been tested by real adversity. Kevin Murphy, who had made increasingly personal attacks on Marcus's character and suitability for service, found himself unable to speak as he contemplated the magnitude of his error. The recruit he had suggested abandoning during the march was someone who had already demonstrated courage under conditions that none of them could imagine. General Blackwood stepped forward, his voice taking on the tone reserved for ceremonies that honored military sacrifice and service. "Recruit Chen, your Purple Heart was awarded following an operation in which you sustained injuries while conducting a high-risk rescue mission that saved the lives of 17 civilians trapped in a collapsed structure during a natural disaster." The revelation created a cascade of realizations that transformed Squad Charlie's understanding of everything they had witnessed during their training cycle. Marcus's careful movements weren't evidence of weakness, but the result of injuries sustained. While saving lives, his tactical knowledge wasn't theoretical speculation, practical experience gained under the most demanding circumstances possible. Command Sergeant Major Williams, whose own combat experience had taught him to recognize genuine military virtues, addressed the assembled squad with the authority of someone who had earned the right to speak about courage and sacrifice. "Gentlemen, Recruit Chen's operation took place 18 months ago. He was serving as a volunteer with a federal emergency response team during the earthquake that struck Northern California." Brian Foster, who had been the most sympathetic member of Squad Charlie, felt a wave of shame as he realized that his limited support for Marcus had been woefully inadequate. Given the true nature of his character and service record, the person they had been treating as a liability was someone who had already proven himself under conditions far more dangerous than anything they would face during basic training. Carlos Mendoza, whose family military tradition had shaped his understanding of honor and service, stood transfixed as he tried to reconcile his criticism of Marcus with the revelation that he was addressing someone who had already earned military recognition for valor. His grandfather's teachings about respecting those who had proven themselves in combat now seemed like accusations against his own behavior. Jake Thompson, whose struggles with addiction had made him eager to identify someone else as the squad's weak link, found himself confronting the reality that he had been attacking someone whose psychological strength had been tested and proven under circumstances that would have broken most people. His own past problems seemed trivial compared to the responsibility Marcus had carried during his rescue operation. Michael Davis, the youngest squad member, stared at Marcus with wide eyes as he tried to process the transformation of someone he had dismissed as inadequate into a decorated veteran whose service record exceeded that of anyone he had ever met. His youth and inexperience, which had made him susceptible to the opinions of older squadmates, now seemed like massive disadvantages that had prevented him from recognizing genuine military excellence. Colonel Mitchell continued reading from the official documentation, her voice carrying the weight of formal military recognition. The citation for Recruit Chen's Purple Heart notes that he sustained a fractured fibula and severe ligament damage to his left ankle when a secondary collapse occurred, while he was evacuating unconscious civilians from an unstable structure. Despite his injuries, he continued the rescue operation for an additional 3 hours until all survivors had been recovered. The details of Marcus's service created a stark contrast with the accusations his squadmates had been making about his fitness for military duty. The injury they had interpreted as evidence of weakness was actually the result of extraordinary courage under fire. The compensation techniques they had criticized as shortcuts were adaptations developed by someone who understood that mission accomplishment sometimes required personal sacrifice. General Blackwood approached Marcus with the respect accorded to soldiers who had proven themselves under the most demanding circumstances. "Son," he said, using the informal address that senior officers reserved for soldiers they held in high regard, "I want you to know that your service during the Sacramento earthquake response operation has been studied by emergency response agencies across the country. Your tactical decisions under extreme pressure saved lives and prevented what could have been a much larger tragedy." The general's words carried additional weight because they came from someone whose own service record included command responsibility for operations where tactical excellence had meant the difference between success and catastrophe. His recognition of Marcus's contributions represented professional acknowledgement from the highest levels of military leadership. Drill Sergeant Hayes, who had observed Squad Charlie's dynamics throughout their training cycle, stepped forward with an expression that revealed his own reassessment of the situation he had been monitoring. "General, if I may ask, how did this information come to the attention of command leadership?" General Blackwood's response revealed the comprehensive nature of military personnel systems, and the importance placed on ensuring that decorated veterans received appropriate recognition and support. Sergeant Recruit Chen's service record was flagged during a routine review of training company rosters. When we discovered that a Purple Heart recipient was experiencing difficulties during basic training, we initiated an investigation to determine if appropriate support was being provided. The revelation that Marcus's situation had come to the attention of senior leadership through systematic monitoring rather than individual complaint demonstrated the military's commitment to protecting soldiers who had already proven their worth through service and sacrifice. It also revealed the level of scrutiny that training operations received from commanders who understood the importance of identifying and developing military talent. Command Sergeant Major Williams addressed Squad Charlie directly, his voice carrying the authority of someone who had spent 3 decades evaluating soldiers under the most demanding conditions. Gentlemen, what you've witnessed here tonight should serve as a lesson about the importance of looking beyond surface appearances when assessing your fellow soldiers. Military service is about character, courage, and commitment to something greater than yourself. These qualities aren't always visible in the way someone moves or the speed at which they complete physical tasks. The Sergeant Major's words cut directly to the heart of Squad Charlie's failures, highlighting their focus on physical performance at the expense of understanding the deeper qualities that actually mattered for effective military service. His decades of experience had taught him that true military excellence was often found in soldiers who had overcome significant challenges rather than those who had never been tested by real adversity. As the implications of the evening's revelations continued to sink in, each member of Squad Charlie found himself confronting not only his misconceptions about Marcus, but also fundamental questions about his own understanding of military values and what it meant to serve with honor. The recruit they had dismissed as unfit for service had been revealed as someone whose courage and sacrifice exceeded anything they had achieved or even imagined. The stage was set for a reckoning that would force every member of the squad to examine their own character and consider what lessons they needed to learn about respect, judgment, and the true meaning of military brotherhood. The silence that followed, Command Sergeant Major Williams's words stretched across the bivouac area, like a physical presence, broken only by the distant sounds of other training squads conducting their evening activities. In the harsh illumination of the field lights, the faces of Squad Charlie revealed the full spectrum of human emotion as 8 young men grappled with the complete destruction of their assumptions about military service, heroism, and their own moral character. Tyler Jameson stood frozen in a position of rigid attention, his mind replaying every cruel comment he had made during the day's march. The image of himself calling out, "Just pretend you're a real soldier," to someone who had already proven his courage under fire would haunt him for the rest of his military career. His family's legacy of military service, which he had wielded like a weapon against Marcus, now seemed like a burden of responsibility that he had failed to understand or honor. "Sir," Jameson said, his voice cracking as he addressed General Blackwood, "I need to report that I have failed in my duties as a squad leader. I have treated Recruit Chen with disrespect and have influenced other squad members to question his fitness for service. I take full responsibility for my actions and the actions of those under my influence." The admission represented a complete reversal of the confident leadership that Jameson had displayed throughout their training cycle. But General Blackwood recognized it as the first genuine military bearing that the young man had demonstrated, showing the kind of accountability that was essential for real leadership, rather than the superficial authority he had been exercising over his squad mates. Derek Patterson stepped forward with the mechanical movements of someone operating under extreme psychological stress. His background in competitive sports had taught him to accept defeat gracefully, but this situation transcended simple winning and losing. This was about fundamental human decency and respect for sacrifice that he had completely failed to understand. "General, I publicly mocked Recruit Chen during the obstacle course climb today," Patterson said, his voice barely above a whisper. "I encouraged other squads to watch what I characterized as his inability to perform basic military tasks. I now understand that I was mocking someone who had already demonstrated more courage than I can comprehend." Patterson's confession revealed the depth of his shame in his recognition that his competitive instincts had led him to attack someone whose achievements made his own high school athletic success seem trivial by comparison. The realization that he had used his natural athleticism to humiliate someone who had earned military recognition through actual service would reshape his understanding of what constituted real accomplishment. Kevin Murphy approached the group of officers with visible reluctance, his earlier confidence replaced by the hollow expression of someone who had discovered something terrible about his own character. His desire to align himself with the squad's dominant personalities had led him to make the cruelest comments of all. Suggestions that Marcus should be abandoned or removed from the squad entirely. "Sir, I suggested that recruit Chen should be left behind during today's march," Murphy said, his voice shaking with emotion. "I said he didn't belong with the squad and that we should abandon him. I made these comments about someone who had already proven his willingness to sacrifice himself for others. I don't know how to apologize for something that inexcusable." Murphy's recognition of the magnitude of his error went beyond simple regret about inappropriate comments. He was confronting the reality that his insecurities and need for social acceptance had led him to attack the very qualities that the military valued most highly. The suggestion that a decorated veteran should be abandoned revealed a fundamental misunderstanding of military values that would require years of growth to correct. Brian Foster, who had made limited attempts to support Marcus during the squad's campaign against him, found himself facing a different kind of shame. His failure to stand up more forcefully for someone who was clearly being mistreated now seemed like moral cowardice rather than diplomatic neutrality. "General, I knew that recruit Chen was being treated unfairly, but I didn't do enough to stop it," Foster said. "I tried to moderate the situation, but I didn't have the courage to challenge the squad's leadership when I knew they were wrong. I failed as a soldier and as a human being." Foster's admission highlighted one of the most important lessons about military service: that passive observation of injustice was itself a form of moral failure. His recognition that good intentions without corresponding action were inadequate demonstrated a level of self-awareness that might eventually lead to genuine leadership capabilities. Carlos Mendoza struggled with the conflict between his family's military traditions and his own behavior during the training cycle. His grandfather's teachings about honor and respect for proven warriors now seemed like direct accusations against his treatment of Marcus. The values he had claimed to represent had been completely abandoned when tested by peer pressure and competitive dynamics. "Sir, my family has served in the military for 3 generations, Mendoza said, his voice heavy with shame. "My grandfather taught me to respect soldiers who had proven themselves in combat. I dishonored my family's tradition by failing to recognize and respect recruit Chen's service. I have no excuse for my behavior." Mendoza's confession revealed the particular pain of someone who had betrayed not just his own moral standards but also the expectations of family members who had established traditions of military honor. His failure to live up to these standards would require him to rebuild his understanding of what his family's service actually meant. Jake Thompson found himself confronting the reality that his eagerness to deflect attention from his own past problems had led him to attack someone whose strength of character made his own struggles seem manageable by comparison. His recovery from addiction, which he had viewed as a significant personal achievement, paled in comparison to the courage Marcus had demonstrated during his rescue operation. "Generally, I used recruit Chen as a target to make myself feel better about my own problems," Thompson said. "I suggested that his injury was more serious than my past addiction issues, as if suffering could be ranked and compared. I now understand that I was attacking someone whose courage I could never match." Thompson's recognition of his motivations revealed important insights about how insecurity could lead to cruelty toward others. His willingness to acknowledge these psychological dynamics demonstrated the kind of honest self-assessment that would be essential for his continued recovery and personal growth. Michael Davis, the youngest squad member, struggled to find words adequate to express his shame about following the lead of older soldiers without forming his own moral judgments. His youth had made him susceptible to peer influence, but he now understood that this was an explanation rather than an excuse for his behavior. "Sir, I'm only 17, but that doesn't excuse what I've done, Davis said. I followed the older guys instead of thinking for myself. I suggested that recruit Chen should find a different squad because I thought he wasn't good enough for us. Now I understand that we weren't good enough for him. Davis's admission revealed both the innocence of youth and the beginning of moral maturity that might eventually lead to genuine military leadership. His recognition that age was not an excuse for moral failure demonstrated the kind of accountability that was essential for personal growth. General Blackwood listened to each confession with the patience of someone who understood that moral education was often more important than punishment in shaping future military leaders. His decades of experience had taught him that young soldiers could learn from their mistakes if they were willing to confront the full implications of their actions. "Gentlemen," General Blackwood said, his voice carrying the weight of professional judgment and personal disappointment. "What you've described represents a complete failure to understand the most basic principles of military service. You've attacked a decorated veteran, mocked someone who had proven his courage under fire, and suggested abandoning a soldier who had already demonstrated his willingness to sacrifice for others." The general's words carried particular weight, because they came from someone whose own service record included command responsibility for thousands of soldiers. His disappointment was not that of a distant authority figure, but of someone who understood intimately what military service required and how completely Squad Charlie had failed to meet those standards. Command Sergeant Major Williams stepped forward with the expression of someone who had spent 30 years developing soldiers and who recognized both the severity of the situation and the potential for redemption if the lessons. "What you've done can't be undone," Williams said, his voice carrying the authority of 3 decades of military experience. "But you can choose how you respond to this knowledge. You can use this as an opportunity to become better soldiers and better human beings, or you can allow shame to destroy your potential for military service." Colonel Mitchell opened her portfolio to additional documentation that revealed the full scope of Marcus's service record and the recognition he had received from multiple agencies for his rescue operations. The revelation that his military decoration was just one part of a broader pattern of service and sacrifice added additional weight to the squad's recognition of their failures. Marcus himself had remained silent throughout the confessions, his military bearing unchanged despite the emotional turmoil surrounding him. When General Blackwood finally addressed him directly, his response demonstrated the maturity and perspective that had been invisible to his squad mates. "Sir, I understand that my fellow soldiers made judgments based on limited information," Marcus said. "I chose not to discuss my background because I wanted to earn respect through my current performance rather than past achievements. I don't hold their comments against them personally. I'm committed to working with them to build an effective squad going forward." Marcus's gracious response revealed the depth of character that had enabled him to maintain his composure during weeks of systematic attack. His willingness to forgive and move forward demonstrated the kind of leadership that was based on genuine strength, rather than the superficial authority that had characterized the squad's previous dynamics. The reckoning was complete, but the real work of rebuilding Squad Charlie's cohesion and moral foundation was just beginning. The night's revelations had destroyed their assumptions about military service and forced them to confront fundamental questions about character, judgment, and what it truly meant to serve with honor. The 3 days that followed General Blackwood's visit transformed Squad Charlie in ways that extended far beyond their immediate training objectives. The field exercise continued as scheduled, but the dynamics between squad members had been fundamentally altered by their confrontation with the reality of Marcus's service record and their own moral failures. What emerged was not just a more cohesive military unit, but a group of young men who had learned invaluable lessons about judgment, character, and the true meaning of service. Tyler Jameson approached his leadership responsibilities with a humility that his privileged background had never required him to develop. Instead of commanding through inherited authority and natural athleticism, he began seeking Marcus's input on tactical decisions and deferring to his experience when planning movements through difficult terrain. The transformation was evident. During the squad's final navigation exercise, when Jameson publicly acknowledged Marcus's superior understanding of route selection and risk assessment, Chen's analysis of this terrain is better than anything I could develop, Jameson announced. To the squad during their mission planning session, his experience with wilderness operations gives him insights that none of us possess. I'm recommending that we follow his tactical suggestions for this phase of the exercise. The reversal was complete and genuine. The young man who had publicly amated Manheli, mocked Marcus for weakness, now recognized him as the squad's most valuable tactical asset. Jameson's family military legacy, which he had wielded as a weapon against others, became a source of motivation to honor the traditions of service that he was finally beginning to understand. Derek Patterson channeled his competitive energy into supporting Marcus rather than attacking him. During the squad's final physical challenges, Patterson positioned himself to provide assistance when Marcus needed to navigate particularly difficult obstacles, using his natural athleticism to help. Rather than to demonstrate superiority, his sports background, which had made him focus on individual performance, evolved into an understanding of teamwork that transcended simple cooperation. Kevin Murphy underwent perhaps the most dramatic transformation, evolving from someone who attacked others to gain social acceptance into a defender of squad unity and mutual respect. When recruits from other squads made casual comments about Marcus's modified techniques, Murphy responded with fierce loyalty and detailed explanations of why. Adaptation and innovation were signs of strength rather than weakness. The most significant moment came during the squad's final evaluation, when Marcus's ankle injury flared up during a particularly demanding movement exercise. Instead of the criticism and impatience that had marked their earlier interactions, his squad mates immediately adjusted their tactics to accommodate his limitations while ensuring mission success. The adaptation was seamless and professional, demonstrating how effective military units actually functioned when guided by mutual respect rather than superficial conformity. Brian Foster discovered that true moral courage required active intervention rather than passive sympathy. He began speaking up immediately when he observed unfair treatment of any squad member, using the lessons learned from his failure to protect Marcus as motivation to become a more effective advocate for military values. His diplomatic skills, which he had previously used to avoid conflict, became tools for building genuine unit cohesion. Carlos Mendoza reconnected with his family's military traditions in a more meaningful way, understanding that honor was earned through character rather than inherited through bloodline. He began sharing stories from his grandfather's service that emphasized respect for proven warriors and the importance of looking beyond surface appearances when assessing fellow soldiers. Jake Thompson used his experience with personal struggle to develop genuine empathy for others facing challenges. His recovery from addiction, which he had previously seen as evidence of his own weakness, became a source of strength that helped him understand how people could overcome significant obstacles to serve effectively. He became the squad member, most skilled at recognizing when others needed support and providing it without judgment. Michael Davis matured rapidly under the influence of positive role models, learning to form independent moral judgments rather than simply following the crowd. His youth, which had made him susceptible to peer pressure, became an asset as he approached military service with fresh perspectives, unclouded by cynicism or predetermined assumptions. The squad's transformation was tested during their final group evaluation, a comprehensive exercise that required them to demonstrate not just individual competence but collective effectiveness under pressure. The scenario involved a simulated rescue operation where they had to evacuate wounded personnel through challenging terrain while maintaining defensive positions against a simulated enemy force. Marcus's experience with actual rescue operations made him the natural leader for the exercise, and his squad mates deferred to his expertise without hesitation. His tactical decisions, informed by real-world experience with life-and-death situations, guided the squad through the complex scenario with efficiency that impressed even the evaluating instructors. But the most significant moment came when the simulation included a scenario where Marcus's injury prevented him from completing a specific physical task, without discussion or hesitation. His squad mates adapted their approach to ensure mission success while protecting their teammate from unnecessary risk. The seamless cooperation demonstrated how effective military units accommodated individual limitations while maintaining collective capability. Drill. Sergeant Hayes observed the squad's evolution with professional satisfaction. Recognizing that the lessons they had learned extended far beyond basic military training, in his 15 years of military service, he had rarely seen such a dramatic transformation in unit. Dynamics are such clear evidence that young soldiers had internalized fundamental military values, Squad Charlie Hayes announced during their final formation has demonstrated the kind of growth that represents the best traditions of military service. You've learned that strength comes in many forms, that leadership requires humility, and that effective units are built on mutual respect rather than superficial conformity. The drill sergeant's recognition meant more to the squad members than any individual achievement they might have earned. They had proven themselves not just as soldiers but as human beings capable of growth, moral courage, and genuine service to something greater than themselves. When graduation day arrived, Squad Charlie stood in formation with the quiet confidence of soldiers who had earned their place through character as well as competence. Marcus's slight limp remained visible, but it was no longer seen as a sign of weakness. Instead, it served as a reminder of sacrifice made in service to others and the kind of courage that couldn't be measured through physical fitness, tests, or standardized evaluations. General Blackwood returned for the graduation ceremony, where he personally presented Marcus with a commendation for excellence in leadership during training. But more importantly, he addressed the entire squad about the lessons they had learned and the example they had set for future classes of recruits. Charlie has demonstrated that military excellence is not about physical perfection or inherited privilege, the general said. It's about character, courage, and the willingness to serve something greater than yourself. These young soldiers have learned to look beyond surface appearances and recognize the true qualities that make someone worthy of wearing our nation's uniform. As the ceremony concluded and the new soldiers prepared to depart for their permanent duty assignments, Squad Charlie gathered for a final group photograph. The image captured 8 young men who had been fundamentally changed by their experience, standing together as brothers who had learned that true strength was measured not by the absence of limitations, but by the courage to serve despite them. Marcus Chen would go on to serve with distinction in multiple deployments. His tactical expertise and calm leadership under pressure, saving countless lives and earning him rapid promotion through the enlisted ranks. But perhaps his greatest achievement was the transformation he had inspired in 7 young men who learned to see beyond appearances and recognize the true meaning of military service. Tyler Jameson, Derek Patterson, Kevin Murphy, Brian Foster, Carlos Mendoza, Jake Thompson, Michael Davis would each carry the lessons of their training experience throughout their military careers and beyond. They'd learned that heroism often came in forms they didn't expect, that strength was sometimes hidden beneath visible limitations, and that the most important battles were often fought not against external enemies, but against their own prejudices and assumptions. The story of Squad Charlie became legendary within the training command, not because of any spectacular achievements, but because it demonstrated how ordinary young people could grow into extraordinary soldiers when guided by proper values and moral leadership. Their experience served as a reminder that military service was ultimately about character rather than capability, about service rather than self-promotion, and about the willingness to sacrifice for others rather than personal advancement. In the end, Marcus's limp had become not a symbol of weakness but a badge of honor that reminded everyone who saw it that true courage was often invisible until revealed by circumstances that tested the depth of human character. The young man who had been mocked for his limitations had taught his entire unit that the most important battles were won not through physical strength but through moral courage, and that the greatest victories came not from defeating others but from overcoming the limitations within themselves. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hits the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.